Before we kick off, I'm going to invite the Reverend Dr. Susan Hartley, if you wouldn't mind leading us in a word of prayer.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege of being able to meet together in your name this evening. And we thank you that you have put this really important subject on the hearts of each one of us. And so we pray for our speakers as they teach us. We pray for the technical team as they do their vital work in the background, that we would know your presence and your grace amongst us in a very meaningful way. And Lord, we do ask you that as we go from this time together, that we will be transformed and that you would help us to be agents of transformation in the places where you have put us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much. Welcome to this webinar on supporting hidden differences. I'm Stuart Rapley and I'm a member of St James Emmanuel Church in Didsbury in Manchester, England. And this webinar is also supported by the Centre for Autism and Theology at Aberdeen University, which we call CAT. In addition to doing a PhD on autism and theology at CAT, I coordinate national discussion groups for autistic and ADHD Christians and lead an exercise in my own church on neurodiversity. I'm also the author of the book Autistic Thinking in the Life of the Church. I'm now retired, but spent most of my career in the management of major organisational change, the relevance of which will become clearer later. I'm supported by 3 other speakers today, and I'll introduce them in a moment. So in my work with churches to address issues of inclusion, welcome and belonging, I usually work in the context of autism and neurodiversity, but I've developed 3 basic convictions in my time. The first one is that what needs to be said and addressed on these topics is pretty generic and is often best dealt with by enabling the appropriate dialogue in the church community. There is not the capacity in most churches to run a major exercise on autism and then another one on ADHD and so on. So a generic approach is more helpful and more practical. Second conviction is that the key to getting this dialogue into the right space is to address our underlying theology, culture, and practices. In my last webinar, I looked at theology. So today we're looking at culture, and I'll leave you to work out what the next webinar might be about. Thirdly, that having said that much of this is generic, there are, of course, distinctive features in each case. In particular, it seems to me that there's quite a difference between visible and hidden differences. This came home to me recently when I had a major problem with my right foot and I was on crutches. I got offers of lifts to church, people opened doors, offered to carry my hymn book to my seat and so on. But at least people knew there was a need for help and they knew what to do, at least on that immediate practical level. On another day, mention that I'm autistic and dyslexic, and there can be either puzzlement or a not always helpful response, such as, oh yes, I have all the same problems. Today's webinar therefore addresses culture with an emphasis towards the more hidden aspects of being different, and it will include research-based findings and practical implications. And this brings me nicely to our first speaker. I've got to know Dr. Penny Pullen through her involvement with the ADHD and Faith discussion group. Penny runs her own leadership consultancy and has recently been supporting a major Church of England programme on equipping leaders on disability. And she's writing a book entitled Seeing and Unseen. And it was Penny who first planted the idea in my mind that responding to unseen differences is a specific area of interest. So Penny is going to start by speaking about the ways in which our church culture is influenced, not just by our theology, but by the everyday culture in which we live. Penny then will be followed by Dr. Leon van Ommen. Leon is a co-director of CAT. He has undertaken research into what he calls the cult of normalcy and has written about this in his book Autism and Worship, a Liturgical Theology. Leon will speak to us on the way that assumptions of normalcy in our national culture have often a strong influence on our church cultures. We'll then take a short break, after which we'll hear from Dr. Krisha Waldock. Krisha is a researcher at Swansea University and also an associate of CAT. Those who follow the CAT podcast, some of you may do that, you will recognise Krisha as one of its co-hosts. Krisha will be sharing with us from her research into the church experience of autistic people and has entitled her talk, What We Say versus What We'll Do. I'll then take a few moments to share some ideas from our approach to the project on neurodiversity at St James Emmanuel, which we are trying to develop in a way that can be used generically. One would hope that, although we speak of culture change in the church, there is in most of our churches an underlying culture of grace and love. So we're really looking, in most cases, at areas of unintended oversight rather than major dysfunction or overt prejudice. Then we'll take a short break and come back with our final session of the day, which is a Q&A session with all of the panelists. And I want to just pause briefly now to acknowledge and thank my support team behind the scenes. They are part of the Autistic Christians discussion group. So today we have Sue, David and Hannah, who are handling the Q&A, the screen management and the transition slides and chat monitoring respectively. And I also want to thank Jonathan from the group who helped us with many of the rehearsals before today. And a friend, John from St James Emmanuel, has done a fantastic job on the webinar graphics, so thanks to him. When we get to the Q&A, I will invite Sue or the Reverend Dr. Susan Hartley to join the presenters on screen for the Q&A session. So without further ado, let's invite Penny Pullen onto the screen.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to join you. I'm here to talk about hidden differences, churches and culture. I'm an independent researcher who teaches leadership at a theological college, but also I spend a lot of my time as a consultant with business in areas of leadership. I've also completed some research on particular hidden differences, which are invisible illnesses and chronic conditions. So that's where my research is based. So I thought it would be helpful to start off thinking about, well, what is culture after all? Because we don't notice it. It's a little bit like this fish in water. We're swimming in culture all the time, but we're so used to it that we don't notice it. And there's a story David Wallace told 20 years ago or so about two young fish swimming along in a stream, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming in the other direction. He nods at them and says, "Morning, how's the water?" The two young fish swim on for a bit, and then one of them looks over at the other and says, "What on earth is water?" So you might not have thought about it before, but you too and your church will be swimming in culture. But unless you've intentionally decided to focus on it, you probably haven't noticed it, but it's there all around you. So let's have a think about what culture is. It's what we swim in, but it's hard to define. People say things like, it's the way things feel around here. It's how things are done around here. It's the unwritten rule book. Some people say it's invisible unless you try and change culture. And then you find out very quickly that lots of people don't like things changing. Edgar Schein talked about culture of an organization as the accumulated shared learning of a group, the correct way to perceive, think, feel, and behave, and a pattern of systems or systems of beliefs, shared values, and behavioral norms that are taken for granted as basic assumptions and eventually drop out of awareness. So it's really important. It's how we perceive each other as well. Culture isn't fixed. It can change. But remember that it generally goes unnoticed. I'm going to share a slightly simplistic diagram here. This is from Hofstede, 30 years ago now. So let's look. There are things that are universal human nature, and there are things that are about individual personalities. And culture fits in the middle. It's specific to a certain group or category, and culture is learned. Obviously, this is quite old, quite simplistic. Culture is often intersectional, interrelated in lots of ways. But let's have a think about some different ways culture can come in. You can have a national culture, for example. The UK culture, for example, is quite different to, say, China. There can be denominational differences. There can be, even within churches, thinking of my own church, the Church of England, there are huge cultural differences from one end of the candle to the other, if you like. The professional cultures, you can have, if you imagine salespeople and actuaries, groups of those, they have very different cultures, and sporting cultures and more. But the national culture is quite strong. It's the way we do things in this country. And that's what seeps into churches. An even older quote is from Miroslav Volf from the wonderful book Exclusion and Embrace. He was talking about different types of culture involved in conflict. But he says that our coziness with the surrounding culture has made us so blind to many of its evils that instead of calling them into question, we offer our own versions of them in God's name and with a good consciousness. And this is what impacts people. Our blindness as to culture means we just take it in, and they can impact people with hidden differences. So, having a look at two aspects of national culture in the UK that can impact those with hidden differences specifically, and I'm going to just scribble on this slide so you can see the hidden differences that were in my research were people with invisible illnesses, invisible physical illnesses and chronic conditions such as ME, long COVID, sometimes cancer and fibromyalgia and other autoimmune diseases. So key things that came out in my research were this one, that churches seem to value doing what people could do over who they were. Churches tend to inherit national cultural assumptions about productivity and also individualism and autonomy. These shape their theology and practice unless people make the effort to notice, because they don't fit our scriptures, and these things don't fit the kingdom of God. So let's look at doing over being. Our UK culture, and Mayer explains this, along with the US and others, prioritizes tasks over relationships, what you can do over who you are. Perhaps this is inherited down from the Protestant work ethic. You know, it's still persisting centuries later. And what you can do is mixed up with definitions of personal worth, says Bray. And others say we're defined by what we do. What we do is related to what we perceive to be our abilities, says Rothman. Yes. So the way we do things has come up in the themes of my research, the way we focus on doing. But think about it, if somebody asks you, they meet you and they say, oh, hello. They probably say, and what do you do? It's a thing that we focus on in our culture. So what about the other one? What about individualism and autonomy being so important? Here, the UK, along with the US and other places, has a cultural focus on individuals. Hofstede defines this as societies in which the ties between individual people are loose. Everyone is expected to look after him or herself and his or her immediate family. And studying this, Hofstede found Great Britain as the third most individualistic country of his set of 76, a little bit behind the US. But people focus on themselves and their immediate family, then relationships with others beyond tends to fade away. Individual achievement leads to competitiveness rather than communal activities and social cohesion. Bonhoeffer states a Christian perspective based on Genesis, saying being free means being free for the other, because the other has bound me to him. Only in relationship with the other, I am free. So it's helpful to think about, what really should our cultures be like in church? The thing about individualism is that actually, if you decide that you want to change things as a leader, even if you use the brilliant change strategies and so on, people can get uncomfortable. And if we are very individualistic, congregation members may well use their prized autonomy and individual rights to move somewhere that suits them better, where they feel less challenged. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of the ways that these cultural challenges showed up in the research that I did on people with invisible illnesses. This was one of the themes of my research that came out. I'm valued for what I do, not who I am. So if people weren't very well, they couldn't really do stuff. And as participant 30 said, there's a lot of pressure. You only seem valued if you do stuff. And another participant, number 14, felt I'm of no value to the church as I'm not well enough to volunteer, which seems really sad. One of the cultural aspects in our churches, one of the ways that culture of doing over being is expressed is through rotas. And rotas are a nightmare. It's something that most people, and I surveyed, actually agreed with. They said that resonated. Fixed rotas that are not flexible. If you want to do anything in church, in many churches, it means signing up to the rota. But if you're not well enough, like this participant 7, who doesn't know if they're going to feel okay or not, so they don't like to commit to things, then they don't get as involved as they might do and feel less included. And they're not seen as doing things. There's another example, which isn't on this slide, which is participant 6, who is undergoing chemotherapy, but due to preach on a Sunday morning. But at 5:30 a.m., she had to rush to A&E with an infection. And she said, you can't predict that. So perhaps if you use rotas in your church, you might like to think about how could these be a little bit more flexible. I remember when I was doing this research, there was somebody who wasn't on any rotas, but did want to be involved. And I said, if I'm down to read in church, if you're up to it and feel okay on the day, would you like me to step out and you can step in? And she said, yes. And then we both cried. So I hope that people will be able to think of ways of including people by being flexible. I also talked about individualism. And this next theme, there are 8 themes in my research. I'm just bringing up a few this time. But this last one, this is when individualism gets pushed to the extreme. Out of the people I interviewed 13 people. 6 of them resonated with this statement: I have disappeared. These are people with invisible illnesses who felt that they'd completely disappeared out of their churches. They were out of sight, out of mind through illness, but yet, they felt they'd been abandoned and forgotten about because they weren't turning up in church. One way a lot of people with invisible illnesses used to turn up in church was through things like this, through live streaming of services and through interactive remote sessions, and a lot of those are disappearing. And then look at this last one. I was told I couldn't go on the home communion list because they're too busy looking after the older people who need it. This is a participant who was stuck at home, homebound due to illness. So, yep. Disabled people, people with hidden illnesses and with visible disabilities need to belong in communities. Swinton says to be included, you just need to be present. To belong, you need to be missed. If we have a very individualistic culture, we are less likely to miss people or even notice that they are not there. This next quote, Miroslav Volf again, is something that you hinted at the very beginning, Stuart. You know, it's not that people are trying and intending to be harmful to people. But if our cultures are not right, then this can be true. Volf says, the havoc wreaked by indifference may be even greater than that brought by lived, practiced hatred. So I will say that actually, thanks to you, participants, you're here. So the brilliant thing is that you're not indifferent. You're listening to this and you're going to go out and start thinking about culture and noticing what is happening in your churches. And I hope that some of the havoc that is wreaked by indifference to those with hidden differences will be reduced as a result of what you hear and what you do as a result afterwards. If you are interested in finding out more about the research that I've been talking about, pretty much everything I've done on that, including a preprint of the book chapter down here, they're all on this website, ethicsofinclusion.study. And there's all sorts of things there, the webinars and blog posts. And there is an upcoming book, I'll just correct the name, it's Seeing the Unseen, Invisible Illnesses, Belonging in the Church, which needs to be written by early next year. So there you are, Stuart.
Thank you very much, Penny. Brilliant. I really loved the way in which you drew some practical instances out of that. You know, culture is very much the water we're swimming in, but you did a great job there of making use of things like rotas and so on to make it feel real. So I'm now going to invite Leon to come onto screen and take us forward then into the whole issue of what he calls the cult of normalcy.
Thank you, Stuart, for the invitation to contribute to this webinar. Thank you, Penny, for that brilliant kickoff of this important topic. And in many ways, I'm just going to follow on from what Penny was saying about culture by looking at one particular aspect, and that is what I call the cult of normalcy. I didn't invent that term. It comes actually from Leonard Davis in the 90s, and then Tom Reynolds in disability theology has written a lot on that as well, and I will refer to those authors in a moment. Just by way of background, just seeing that a lot of my research is on autism, with autistic people, I should say, trying to listen carefully to autistic people, their experience about church, their experience about worship, And so that is very much in the background of what I'm going to say. Now, I'm not going to say too much about all of that, but I'm really going to focus on that concept of normalcy. And that concept of normalcy has everything to do with what Penny was saying about people feeling excluded or included. Has everything to do with belonging. And so that concept of normalcy, I want to explore that a little bit because I think that is at the heart of the dynamics of communities and the dynamics of people feeling that they can belong, that they do belong, or not. So it's a bit academic, bear with me, but I hope it will be helpful to explore those dynamics. Good. So let me just see whether I can click on the next slide. There you go. So Leonard Davis is a disability studies scholar, and he writes especially in light of deafness. And he says this: to understand the disabled body, one must return to the concept of the norm, the normal body. I would like to focus not so much on the construction of disability as on the construction of normalcy. I do this because the problem, in inverted commas, is not the person with disabilities. The problem is the way that normalcy is constructed to create the problem, in inverted commas, of the disabled person. So look at what he is doing here. He says, basically, I want to talk about disability, but actually, in order to talk about disability, I need to talk about how do we even get to the term disability. We need to talk about ability. We need to talk about the norm before we can talk about what deviates from the norm, as it were. So basically, he is reversing the whole discussion from disability to normalcy. That's the concept that he then uses. The construction of what we deem normal, what we deem good, what we deem acceptable, etc. Okay, so that's very much the kind of the starting point here. Right, now Tom Reynolds, I already mentioned him in his 2008 book Vulnerable Communion. By the way, in my opinion, my humble opinion, it's one of the best books in disability theology still, I think, but you might disagree. I think it's really good. But he spends quite a bit of time discussing that concept of normalcy. So he brings that from disability studies into disability theology. And he says normal is a standard that is socially constructed. It can also be critiqued and deconstructed. End of quote. That relates very much to what Penny was saying about culture. Culture is something that we create as human beings, right? And so it is partly learned, it is partly formation, but it is a construct. And that means if you can construct something, you can also deconstruct it. So just saying like, well, this is the norm and this is just what it is, that's just not good enough. We can critique it, we can deconstruct it. And so Tom Reynolds talks then about the cult of normalcy. And the cult, that word really denotes like when normalcy, our norms in the community, becomes elevated to a level of if you don't fit the norm, you don't belong. That's basically the cult of normalcy, or the tyranny of the normal, in the words of Stanley Hauerwas. And what is at the heart of that cult, Tom Reynolds says, is fear. We fear the other. We fear that which we don't know. We fear that because when we are confronted with something that we don't know, that we don't have a framework for, it upsets our norms and what we think is normal. It upsets, it disrupts our normal way of being and doing. And so we want to evade that. So I just mentioned that word framework. So where does that culture of belonging, the norms, that normalcy, where does that come from? Well, we need to go back to Charles Taylor for that. And Charles Taylor talks about frameworks. And a framework is basically everything that makes up that culture that we think is good. So Charles Taylor says we are born into this world and we all long for the good. And the good is everything that we decide together is helpful, is good, is valuable for living together, right? And so, for example, we all agree that it is good if everyone has access to education. We think it's good that everyone has a house to live in. We agree that it is good if we all can experience psychological safety, right? Those are things that we value, that's the good. And all those things together make up that framework in which we live, or in other words, the culture in which we live, what we value. So in the words of Reynolds, the good is what we find meaningful about life together. That's a short definition of that. And so that good includes then also a sense of belonging. We all want to belong to something. And so that framework, which determines what is good, is established in interaction with others in community, because it's never an individual thing, right? Because I can decide that maybe it is good to sleep outside. No, that's a really bad example. I can decide that it is really good to... now I need to think about a good example. Something weird. Like, I can decide it's good to go out every day and carry a large backpack with me that's way too heavy and I need some support and all of that. And everyone is like, why would you do that? Just leave the backpack at home, you don't need it, right? And then you don't need support and all of that. That is a really silly example, but I hope it works. So it is because we want to live together that we are longing for that which is good together, which we agree on, because that creates a group to which you can belong. So I said the magic word, belonging. So in order to belong to the community, then one needs to align with the framework, with what is deemed good and what is deemed not good enough. Let me give another example, which may be more helpful. So I live in Aberdeen, and if I want to support Aberdeen Football Club, I need to go to their matches wearing red, right? That is the color of Aberdeen Football Club. If I go and I wear green and the opponent of the day is also wearing green, then I don't belong to Aberdeen Football Club, right? You can see immediately why I would kind of be excluded from the seating area where the Aberdeen fans are and all of that, right? Because I don't align with the framework. We deem it is good to wear red because it gives us an identity together, right? And so you need to align with that framework. You need to align with the norm of the group. And the norm in Aberdeen Football Club is simply red, right? That's the color. So it follows that if one cannot reach the threshold of what is good, one does not belong. In other words, if I don't have red in my wardrobe, I've got a problem. And especially if I've got only green in my wardrobe, in that same example, right? So I need to have some kind of what you could call social capital in order to buy recognition of that community. Does that make sense? I hope so. Good. So the framework, and this is an important thing to realize, the framework always serves the majority, right? Because it is constructed together, it is the group that decides what is good, that is the dynamic that is at play here, and therefore it will inevitably always serve the majority and inevitably exclude some people, because some people might not have red in their wardrobe, to use that example. But of course you can extrapolate that to other things, which we'll come to in a moment. Now, Tom Reynolds argues this dynamic of trying to belong, that is playing out in every situation, every day. So here's a somewhat long quote, but this really makes the point. And apologies for that weird kind of thing in bracket there. The stranger cannot be assimilated or integrated into the community and are in fact deemed an impoverishment, perhaps even something dangerous, because they do not present what we consider familiar or acceptable. In fact, we come to fear such elements and people. Their difference puts conventions into question. Strangeness disrupts the predictable world and so disorients, making us conscious of the extent to which we are vulnerable. The predictable world is thrown into relief. Because of this, communities develop protective strategies through what I call the code of normalcy. Right? So here's in a nutshell what I tried to explain earlier. The stranger, the other, that which we don't know, that's an impoverishment or maybe dangerous even, because it doesn't fit our framework, right? And what doesn't fit our framework, we will exclude that. Now, that whole concept of normalcy in the literature, usually it's defined as a kind of this is the norm. I define it slightly different. Is that because I'm an academic? I don't know, but I thought there needs to be something else to this definition because it's very dynamic. What Reynolds is saying here is very dynamic. It plays out in every situation, right? And so the way I define normalcy in my book, Autism and Worship, is normalcy is a set of dynamics by which communities safeguard the boundaries of what and who they deem normal and therefore acceptable. Those who fall within those boundaries can be integrated into or even belong to the community, but those who do not fall within the boundaries either need to change or will be rejected. And here, Reynolds again, our bodies always negotiate social space by participating in an exchange of goods, whether going to school, playing on a sports team, working in retail, raising children, or meeting for coffee with friends. In every situation, even in the virtual worlds of cyberspace, we are present to others. That is, we portray or offer something that is recognized and received, or not, as of significance. And so we
Leon, you have 1 minute.
And so we can call this the social capital that we have. We buy recognition by wearing the right color, speaking the right language, etc., etc. And so what do we value in our Western frameworks? That we are socially adept, able-bodied, independent. And you can see why people with hidden differences fall out with the curve. Many disabled and neurodivergent people cannot keep up with this list and therefore fall out with the boundaries of normalcy. And so you can see why this is an evasion strategy, because it is all about conformity and consent. And so to conclude here, being evasive, the cult of normalcy is not able to deal with the presence of the other who does not pass the threshold of the community's framework and who does not have enough body capital to purchase recognition. Now, some churches, some faith communities do it wonderfully well and open their boundaries to belonging, but here's the challenge, and this is, I think, just furthering what Penny was saying about the culture. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leon. So I really like the way there that you talked about culture being something that we construct and that we learn about, and also the need that we have for the normal. And it kind of reminds me of that old FBI story about how they train people to recognize counterfeit cash, which is to train them to recognize the normal stuff. So that sense of normal is very prevalent in our culture. Thank you so much. And so Krisha Waldock is going to come and speak to us next and introduce us to her research, which used a group of autistic churchgoers and looked at their experience. So Krisha, do you want to come on and onto screen, and we'll hear from you. Thank you very much.
So my name's Krisha, as Stuart said. It's like Trisha with a K. Of anyone who hadn't heard the name before. I currently work at Swansea University, but I've had extensive links with CAT for a number of years, including throughout my PhD. I'm autistic, I'm disabled, and I'm talking about what we say versus what we do, which is really boiling down to the key point of what I'm saying in terms of the difference between the two, and really picking up a lot of the threads that both Penny and Leon have already started with and explained actually so well. I'm hoping I can give some really practical thoughts behind it. I have got sections where I have got quote bubbles with participant quotes from both my doctoral thesis and my master's thesis. The names attached are not the actual people's names, just to clarify. They are the pseudonyms that I gave them by hitting next, 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 next on a randomizer many years ago. So the idea of what we say and what we do are often two completely different things. So, for example, we can say, I like chocolate, but whether you want to eat a whole Easter egg at that moment, and I say that because yesterday I made the really bad decision to eat 2 Easter eggs after having bought them for my sister. So I've now got to go buy her another Easter egg. But it's almost what we say we do and what we actually do are two different things. And when we bring that into broader culture, what Penny has said, and also into what Leon was saying as well, we can see that in our church circles that can really shape and shift how we say and do things. And in practical theology, there's two particularly fancy ways of explaining the kind of what we say versus what we do. So Helen Cameron and colleagues spoke about the voices of theology. Basically, they're different narratives of theology, different ways of viewing and understanding theology. And it also, bringing us back to the topic that we're talking today, helps us notice different bits of church culture. So espouse theology is what we say we do. So I like to eat chocolate. And what we actually do, me going and eating 2 of my sister's Easter eggs and then me having to go replace them, is what we actually do. And I think these voices are a useful tool when considering how we respond to people who are like us, people who are not like us, people who are obviously different, people who are not obviously different. But actually, as Stuart said at the beginning, it's quite useful across the board when we're thinking about how we do church. So the operant theology is what we actually do. And through the conversations that I had throughout my master's and my doctoral work, so I spoke to autistic Christians and autistic Muslims. I spoke to autistic people who had attended churches and mosques. I undertook some autoethnographic work, which wasn't part of the thesis itself. It really helped me figure out where I sit in position to this as an autistic Christian. And I also spoke to just bunches of churchgoers, groups of churchgoers and groups of people who attend mosques as well, to see how they would understand and interact with autistic people. And what really struck me is, and this is reflected in some of the academic literature, is actually a lot of what we think is the norm and we think is kind of standard, linking back to what Leon and Penny have said, has tones of being quite able-bodied or neurotypical. And there is also quite a bit of research showing that churches, particularly in America, they haven't done some of the work over here, have quite strong in-group dynamics. Basically, when I say strong in-group dynamics, it sounds quite fancy, but it's basically how the group works. It has quite strong glue that sticks it all together. So a good example would be, I try to stick, so I don't wear mascara because I have horrific allergies and all sorts. But when I stick my fake eyelashes on, sometimes it sticks really well. So there's a really good dynamic, sticks everybody together. And it works cohesively, and as a group, it's really strong. And when we think about culture and the way we do things, that can be really advantageous. Sometimes my eyelashes, like today, refuse to stick on. So it's been one of those days where not only do I eat my sister's chocolate, I'm probably making everyone laugh here, but my eyelashes wouldn't stick on. That you would say that's almost like a very weak dynamic. People are not so cohesive and not so together. And this idea of the norm being so strong within how we do church. So a lot of how we do and say things. That I was brought up in a Baptist church. I attended a Methodist church for a number of years, and I have very strong connections with the Church of England. Lots of things like expecting us to stand up and sit down at certain times are just kind of built-in expectations. But if you're not aware of that or are not able to do that because your body and brain work differently, you could almost set out as different. A couple of my participants from my doctoral research also picked up on this really strong glue that can hold us together. And I think that's really useful where we have quite similar beliefs in some ways. Olivia said that churches for her can feel quite cliquey, especially if she's not used to the church. She's really new to the church. She doesn't quite understand how things work. And Lisa said it was like they lived by the Bible but didn't. You know what I mean? It was like they've read it, but they didn't bring it into their lives. So it was almost this difference for also what I was saying on the last slide. So what people were saying that they do was very different to what they were actually doing. And I had great fun when I made my slides, popping this together on Canva, because it was really useful for me to see how it all fits together. What really got me interested in the first place, of being really interested in church kind of culture and how that excludes disabled and neurodivergent people, including those of us who have differences that are not always visibly obvious, is that everything kind of all fits together. So it's part of a whole system, and how people belong, what agency we might have, how accessible stuff is, it's all impacted by what people say they do, these unwritten rules of these expectations, and what people actually do. And from conversations I had with quite a few autistic religious group goers, particularly churchgoers, it was quite clear that people saying that their churches were really welcoming, but then actually people not understanding perhaps autistic differences was really frustrating and made them feel like they didn't belong, they didn't fit there. And this links almost a nice pliffy way of saying it is almost a barrier to belonging, this disjoint. And quite a few people have said this in academic and non-academic circles, but I've popped myself and my colleague and friend Precious Sango as the references. We've spoken about this in a paper we did a few years ago. And what became really, really clear from the conversations I had is that people, if they can't meet these really normative standards, so this is the way we should do things, people really struggle to feel part of some churches. And I think it's really important at this point to say that not everywhere is the same. Penny said this, Stuart has said this. And I guess it's really important at this point, if you want, you can take a screen cap of this slide or a picture. There's some questions that I was mulling on, thinking around, well, how do we kind of reflect? I love to tell people to go away and reflect, but it's such an intangible thing. Sometimes having some prompts is a really good place to start. So what is my church like? I mean, the church I grew up in had really hard seats, flags for the kids, always people welcoming on the door, but you didn't know who was the welcome team unless you got to know them because they didn't wear badges. So it's those kinds of things of what is your church like? Do you like to have loud music? Do you like to have more contemplative stuff? I can't say that word, contemplative. Do you have a mixture of different worship styles? How are people welcomed in? Is liturgy very wordy? Is it more expressive? It's all lots of different things. What denomination is it? Different denominations have different expectations and do different things, but there'll be some commonalities across them. What are the services like? What's the music like? What are the sermons like? Are there lots of different people from different backgrounds or walks of life? Or is it lots of different people who perhaps have had similar trajectories? And I think these are all really useful things to consider. In one of the focus groups I had, Tara said, some Christian denominations do things better than others. This was in her opinion. And I think that's really important. So kind of not saying that some places are really kind of everywhere is bad. Actually, it's really, really individual between person, fit, and everything else. So I guess practical tips are really useful and really tangible, and people always like practical tips. And whenever I've done training and talks, people want to know, what can I do? And one of the things people always want is a checklist. And like Leon, checklists, I'm going to say checklists don't work. I understand why people want checklists, because it gives people really breakdownable things and makes it really tangible, because a lot of things about culture change are actually really big, difficult to grasp, and can also be very hard to kind of know if you're making change. But my reservation with kind of a checklist is that when you've done the ticks, it's all done. Whereas actually this is maybe a list you do over and over and over again. Change can be scary or worrying. I mean, I've been in social groups and churches where change has happened and found that quite threatening myself. So I think that's quite normal and natural. And when I did the interviews for my masters, when I was asking some of the questions I was asking, Nigel said to me, I would hope that we welcome all people, but your very asking of that question tells me there may well be things we do that set up barriers. As Penny has said, actually attending something like this and listening to neurodivergent people is a massive plus. It shows you're already clocked in and you want to know more. Also picking up on what Penny has said, it is okay to just be in church spaces. In quite a lot of literature, there is suggestions around giving people roles, making people feel like they do something, especially for autistic people, people with a learning disability. But maybe we should be reframing the roles as a means to relationship rather than doing for the sake of fitting in and doing for the sake of getting the thing done. And are we doing stuff to performatively feel like we're part of it, or are we doing stuff to genuinely be part of what's going on? Small groups and house groups actually came back as really helpful for autistic people, in particular in church settings, and they're things that I found particularly helpful. I'm currently not in one, but when I lived in Berlin, it was a really helpful. So I lived in Berlin, I taught English for a short period of time after I graduated from my first job. And that was something that really helped me build those relationships and make it about learning about people's lives, being curious about what they understand, and helped us also engage with faith and scripture and all that other things as well. So Judith says we've got to guard against this idea of feeling that everyone needs to feel like they belong because they're doing things. Some people want to just be there and soak up the atmosphere and know that that's their special place.
So, Krisha, you've got 1 minute.
Thank you, Stuart. A sensory audit for your church. The Autism Education Trust has a fantastic tip list that I found just from Googling sensory audit this morning. I realised I hadn't put any links. Things like the spell and the space framework are also quite helpful, and even though a lot of these ideas are quite school related or workplace related, actually I'd argue they're really useful for churches as well. There's some fantastic resources that perhaps could be used in things like home groups, maybe for sermon, CPD for clergy. CPD is always a bit of a hot topic. I've put some ideas of some resources on the slide. I'm really sorry, Stuart, I didn't put your book down, but I would add Stuart's book to the list as well. I was just kind of rushing, what kind of variety of different things. And actually, there's so many more examples of both more theological things and lived experience and really engaging with the structures of the church that we can really grapple at from lots of different angles. I've popped my link tree up there for some of the ideas around things that I've done, and everyone can help make a space that's more welcoming. So as Judith said, we've all got a joint responsibility of making people feel comfortable, accepted and respected. So that was my spiel. I hope you enjoyed laughing at me eating too much chocolate and not getting my eyelashes stuck on properly. I have the Autism and Theology podcast logo because I'm obviously heavily involved with the centre. I've got also the link for the CAT podcast and where you can read my work as well. And I will hand back to Stuart.
Thanks, Krisha. Brilliant stuff. Thank you so much. One of the things that occurred to me listening to that was that as we've gone through the various speakers, this idea of culture is the water we swim in, but we just don't notice it. So we're in that sort of normal group that we've talked about, we don't notice it. But if you're in the out group, you see it just kind of grates on you, and it's very obvious, and it's very difficult, and it's very painful. And the majority are just sort of swimming along and sort of saying, what are they talking about? So in one sense, we want to bring those two together today because they're all part of the same thing. And the thing about checklists, absolutely. So that's going to feed into what I'm going to say now, and hooks into what I said in my introduction, that in the end, dialogue is what matters, and it's talking to people. So I'm going to share my screen. What are we learning in practice with all of this? So one of the things that comes to mind is that a lot of culture is about what we believe, it's about our values, it's about our attitudes, often very somewhat invisible things, and often it's manifest in the way of biases. And one of the things I found very helpful was Brian McLaren, who's at the Centre for Action and Contemplation, has produced something called Learning How to See. So it's a podcast, and he talks about a whole set of different biases there. I think he has 12 or 13. So, and one of the things that he says is that biases are not necessarily bad in themselves. In one way, they are God's way, nature's way, if you like, of helping us to cope with it, just the sheer complexity of life. But sometimes they do become a problem. We have a situation, and we've just heard several examples where a certain bias can be a problem. And then we have to take it on and deal with it. And we see this in the life and the ministry of Christ. So a number of examples. So in John 9, you have the leaders coming to him talking about the man who was born blind. You know, whose fault is it? Who sinned, his parents or the man? And Jesus goes, no, sin's got nothing to do with it. So in John 4, the disciples come and find Jesus talking to a woman, but not only a woman, but a Samaritan woman who knew. So, and Jesus has to challenge that. In Luke 10, there's the whole story of what we call the Good Samaritan, or the certain Samaritan, as Jesus said. And the question is, well, who's my neighbor then? Well, oh no, surely not a Samaritan. And then you've got the story in Matthew 12 where Jesus challenges the religious leaders. Well, is it okay? Is it good to do good on the Sabbath? And so as that they were holding up the law to him, and so he fights back on that. And so these biases that Jesus deals with as he finds them in life. So I'm just going to share 5 quick ideas on what it means to build culture. How do we go about that? And it's much more of an agricultural gardening image rather than the idea that we can run a training course or write a checklist and that's job done and the trainer can go home and we're away. It's much more agricultural, where the farmer needs to till the land and get the soil right, and then sow the seed, and then nurture the seed and pray for the right rain and sunshine, and so on and so forth. So 5 ideas then. The first thing is the idea that the whole process of change in culture is a process. It's not a training event. Training can be part of it, and we'll come back to that, but it's not a training event. So here's just a model that's very useful as a way of putting that sense of process together. So we start with a situation which we call hero, where some individuals are kind of doing it well, but that's not common across the whole community. and we then start to document or set out what we think good looks like, trying to, if you like, define what we think the right sort of approach to normal should be. And then we start to improve the behaviours and the attitudes as we introduce training or whatever it is, and we start to build the right sort of behaviour, but it's still on a learning curve, and eventually we get to a habitual place where that just becomes the way we do things, and so we almost don't need to look at the documentation anymore. That's just the way it happens here. So but that can take a number of years. So second then, this whole question of normalcy and so on begs the question, what does good look like? So here are 8 things that in our group we've come up with as a result of discussion around a number of people. A healthy dialogue. So I mentioned that in my introduction, and I think that's very important that we talk to people. So people ought to be able to talk to autistic people without putting their foot in it in the first sentence. They don't have to be experts, but that dialogue. Something for everyone. Not everything in my church is going to be suitable for me. That's fine. I don't expect that. But if there's nothing, that's not good. And what if I'm not there? I think it was Leon, or somebody quoted John Swinton talking about being missed if we're not there. Awareness of biases. Well, in one sense, that speaks for itself from today. A place to belong. So Krisha just mentioned that, whether it's a particular service, a particular home group, we all need a place which feels like home to us in the church. Spirituality and theology diversity. So in our church, there's probably a sort of fairly set way that we talk about God, and we talk about relating to God, and we think about spirituality and our theology and so on. And people who are different, and I'm coming from the sort of neurodiversity angle in a lot of this, they may think differently about some of this thing, and so that's okay. Opportunities to contribute. We're not just people who've got problems. We've got gifts and strengths as well. So it's not all about how do we break the barriers so that we can just manage to be here without feeling crushed or alienated or whatever. We've got something to contribute. And then celebration of difference. Well, we don't want to be sort of bashing away at all of this stuff every day, every week, and so on. But the calendar does create opportunities. So Pride, Gay Pride Week or whatever. In the world of autism, there's an Autism Awareness Week, Worldwide Autism Awareness Week. So we can use some of those opportunities, maybe in our sermons and so on, to build up and showcase some of these things. So number 3 then, it needs leadership and support. And so what we've done is we have set up a sort of three-party system here. So we've got a working group. So we're the guys that are going to do the work and get the stuff written or get it made or whatever it is. We'll do the stuff. But if all we do is create stuff, hand it over, it's going to last about 2 weeks, isn't it? Because somebody will say, good idea, we'll do that. That'll last 2 weeks before the next thing comes along, and sorry, we haven't had time to do any of that for several months. So we need the staff team and the clergy and those who lead the day-to-day to actually get it into the system. When we're planning sermon series, when we're planning for the next year, this stuff is part of what we do and how we lead services and so on. And then we need sponsors. So in our context, so it's an Anglican church, so it'd be the PCC, but it might be another group in your church. But that body that takes ownership of it, that basically says, yes, this is important in our church. We are doing this. That's fine. And in many ways, they don't have to do an awful lot. Occasionally, they may well have to make a sort of priority call on resources or funding or something like that. But in essence, they're just giving that sponsorship and that sense of this is core, this is what we're doing. And of course, all of those groups then interact together. And not every difference needs a formal working group. So in our church, the whole issue of sexuality has been something that we've worked through over 10 plus years. So I don't think there's a working group on that, but I'm sure that there are key movers in that space. Number 4, how are we doing? So in our church, we say, well, our core values are belonging, believing, becoming. So you ask the question, so how are we doing on that? Okay, so we're suggesting putting together just a 1-page report to go to the PCC once every year, once every 6 months, and very simply a bit of space to talk narrative. What have we been up to since the last report? And what about those kind of what does good mean criteria? How are we doing on those? Where are we? Are we going up, down, sideways, backwards on those? And what about the different groups that we've got? So the different threads, the different differences. Where do we feel we are on that journey from hero to habit? And then lastly, just again, a bit of narrative that says, okay, what sort of stuff do we need to be focusing on in the next period? So very simple, but it forces us to go through the process of asking the questions, given that we've got some sense of what we would like as a sort of target normal, if you like. So, and then the last thing to say is that this is multi-threaded, it's multi-dimensional. So it's not about running a training course and then that's it done. So we've set up a number of different threads. So the first one is, what do we want to do with our website? What do we need in terms of awareness and training? So we've got different audiences. So the people that run the children's work need different training or different awareness to those who are in the PCC and so on and so forth. So we can't just treat everybody the same. Services, how do we need to improve the way we lead our services or the content that we have and so on and so forth? And then the reporting that I've just highlighted. So we've got those 4 things. And then this is my sort of change background coming in a little bit, but so we've then set up a number of what we called releases. So we don't want to just have everything in a constant state of flux and we don't know what's going on. So we just sort of package things together, put all of these in here. Okay, not asking you to memorize these or whatever. These are ours. You can work out your own, but just on the website then, we've put some service descriptions of our different services that reflect the input of neurodiverse people, and building descriptions coming up next, and then a sort of integrated access page and so on and so forth. And you can work out your own. So those are just 5 quick practical ideas, but doing that agricultural thing, getting the land ready for what needs to come. And you can map that back against your hero to habit journey. So there we go. We're going to go into our Q&A session now. So panel and Sue.
Yeah, so we've got 5 really good questions. So I'm going to take them in order of the most votes. And so the first one is for everybody, and this is how it goes. It says, recently I've become acquainted with Damien Milton's concept of double empathy. I wonder if that approach helps to overcome the frameworks of normalcy, both in how we envision normal church practice, but also any preferred tendency to begin with particular explanatory systems in autism studies. And then at an operational level, do we need to query both our ecclesial culture but also our understanding of autism culture?
Okay, so Leon, do you want to comment on that?
So the double empathy problem, for those who don't know what it means, basically what it says is, so very often we say autistic people do not understand the facial expressions, for example, of neurotypical people, and they don't understand the communication of that. And Damien Milton, autistic scholar, said, well, why don't we turn that around? You can also equally say that neurotypical people or non-autistic people don't understand autistic communication, autistic facial expression, and all of that. So it is reversing or saying, well, it's a mutual communication barrier. So rather than placing the onus or the burden or the blame, if you want, on one particular group of people, in this case autistic people, let's say, well, no, we don't understand each other, so what do we do about that, right? So it's a double empathy problem. So that's the concept. Is that going to help to overcome normalcy? To start with that question, it can go a long way in the sense that what it does is, as soon as we are aware that the communication differences or barriers or understanding or awareness is actually bi-directional, that helps us immensely to become present to the other, to listen to the other, to try to understand the other, and to acknowledge our own limitations. So in that sense, yes, it does a lot of good work. Is it the complete answer? I don't think so, because it's as Penny was saying, like it's a culture really, and normalcy is very much embedded in a culture. It's the safeguarding of the cultural boundaries of the group, basically. That's what normalcy is.
I think my gut feeling would be yes, it does a lot, because I think when we look at how different people experience the world differently, one key part of Damien's work is that he uses lots of very fancy words, dispositional differences. So it's not only the things like we might use eye contact differently and facial expressions differently, but also the sensory world that we can experience differently. I think Niall is nodding his head because I'm particularly thinking of his work on autism and worship and the sensory experiences in worship as well. So I think I would say it shows and this is where it's not just an autistic, non-autistic thing in a way. It's we don't understand how other people do things which is part of the double empathy problem. So part of me just thinks it's an absolutely yes to how it can explain some of what's going on. I think in terms of overcoming normalcy, part of the issue is we haven't yet overcome the double empathy problem more broadly yet. So and people kind of make efforts, but in spite of all the advocacy that's going on, it still persists. So I'm wondering almost if stuff around cultural change almost needs to include some of the stuff around power as well, and who does and doesn't get listened to. Penny's nodding her head, which is really good. Because I think sometimes that when we want to make cultural change, we do what's easiest rather than what's perhaps needed. And I think sometimes what happens with double empathy stuff is the easier stuff happens rather than what's needed happens. And I think second question at operational level, I would say both ecclesiastical culture and autism culture definitely both need questioning our understanding of it.
Just to add, not to repeat those things, but I think the standard view had been for many years, and this was based on research with kids, this is how kids go and create what we call a theory of mind and understand what people are thinking. This is how they do it. Autistic people aren't doing that, therefore they don't have any theory of mind, they don't have empathy and so on. Damien Milton comes along and says, well, here's a bunch of grown-up adult people and they seem to be doing some. And so it kind of throws it into the question, that whole normalcy thing, that we've assumed this is the way you do it and that's the only way you do it. Well, it could just be that autistic people are doing it differently. They may be learning different techniques. They may not be looking at your eyes and reading your face, but they may be using other information or whatever and doing it differently. So I think it just challenges that question as to what's the normal way to do it. So it's quite a helpful illustration.
Thank you. Let's go on to the next question. It is for Christian and Penny specifically, and this person has written, for my assignment in my last module at St Hild, Level 4 in BA Theology, I put together a web page entitled, Is Your Church Really Inclusive? It is an attempt at self-evaluation tool. It is drawn largely from my own experience as a nomadic boater visiting different churches around the country. I am registered severely vision impaired and have a chronic condition, hidden disability. However, I have tried to include all disabilities in the evaluation. I find that many churches fall very short of the level of inclusiveness that they think they offer.
I do have a slide actually. I asked the participants who had unseen illnesses, hidden illnesses, how included they felt, and then how inclusive their church said that they were. And I thought this is really fascinating. So I'll share that if I may. And this is the result. Can you see how the people said their experience of welcome as someone with an invisible illness was, you can see there quite a lot with ones and twos and threes. A couple of people said 4 and one said 5. And then when I asked the same people how they reckon their church would rate themselves on their welcome of disabled people, actually 6 people said their churches would rate themselves as 5 out of 5 in terms of being welcoming to disabled people. And the lowest score was 3 out of 5. So there's a big disparity between how welcoming churches say they are and actually how welcoming people with invisible illnesses in my study felt that their churches were. So that really fits your question.
Sue, can I just come in?
Yes, of course, Stuart.
Yeah, just one sentence on the back of that. In my MA, I interviewed a number of people, and I asked them similarly, what do you think about this, whatever it was? What does your church think, and what would the congregation say? And got some similar kind of disparities between what the autistic people were saying and thinking, and what they thought their church would say about the same thing. So just add that, yeah.
Thank you, Stuart, very much. Okay, one person has asked 2 questions, and I think they're both really directed to Krisha, because they're both in the whole area of sensory, asking sensory information. So she asked about space and spell, and she also has asked where she can find a website that shows examples of a sensory audit.
Sensory audit, I quickly Googled one this afternoon.
Yeah.
Autism Education Trust have a really good one. What I might suggest is, rather than me sharing my screen to every single resource, because I think the issue was I didn't want to give you just tons and tons of links, because it would be death by links. What I'll do is I'll compile it and send it to Stuart for him to maybe disseminate to everyone afterwards who had registered.
Right.
I think that might be more helpful, so people then have time to have a look through it. Spell and space are both ways of just understanding and supporting people more generally. They're both person-centered, so you're doing what is best for the other person. Spell is structure, positive, empathy, low arousal links. That's one way of thinking how we work with people. It kind of came from the National Autistic Society and a lot of work they did. Stuart's nodding his head. I'm really glad I got that right.
I used to be a trustee, so
yeah, which is really helpful. And basically, it's just a way of building relationships with people, considering the sensory environment someone's in, considering how other people if you're in a group, might be working with that person, and considering how that person is experiencing the world. Space is a newer one. I just need to bring that up because I could not quite remember.
Yeah, that's Dr. Mary Doherty's paper, isn't it?
It is, and I had a chat with Sue about that recently. So basically that's a newer one. It's more healthcare focused, but again, it's still very applicable to churches, I'd argue. So you're looking at sensory environment, how predictable something is. So can people figure out what's going on? Is it clear what's going on? How accepting you are of different people, how people are communicating. So not just using what I call mouth words and being clear with those mouth words, but if somebody needs an augmented or alternative communication, like a spell board, or they use an app, is that supported and accepted? And again, understanding for how they're experiencing the world as well. And I think there's lots of different people who've looked at things like sensory environments in churches, or kind of communication side of churches. So there's kind of lots of different things, but very few people are putting it into practice and saying hello, which would be really, really helpful, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Krisha. I mean, certainly with the space, it is very adaptable to other contexts because I've used it training in churches and other things as well. So, you know, again, if I give the link of that paper to Stuart, again, that might be a paper that he could send out to everybody later. Okay, I'll be happy to move on. So the next question is, how can those within the church who display cognitive dissonance become aware that they are cognitively dissonant? Stuart, I don't know whether that's something that is a little bit up your street, isn't it?
It is a little bit. It's a bit like the question we had one Saturday when someone talked about masking, but apparently she was asked in an interview, you know, when did she mask, and so on and so forth, and she couldn't really work that out. So this is about self-awareness. So I don't think you switch this on. I mean, it took me years to work out what was going on. So I would suggest you learn this backwards, to look for times and situations where you feel just absolutely worn out and fatigued. Okay, and that may give you the clue. If you look back, kind of think, well, that's not surprising, because you know, if you went to a 3-hour rock concert, you know, very loud music, or you know, whether you're autistic or not, you know, so the chances are your head would be ringing, you couldn't sleep, and so on and so forth, and then you would end up really tired, you know, the day after or whatever. So I think there's a pattern here where you study yourself and you kind of think, whoa, so you know, why did I feel tired there? And then you sort of trace back and you kind of think, do you know what? This is just me being completely wired. So, for example, I had to learn. I was a management consultant, worked till 10 o'clock in the hotel room, up at 6, back on the client site, and I couldn't work out why I had a big insomnia problem. You know, not getting to sleep till 2 o'clock in the morning, and then having to get up again at 6. And after I was diagnosed, and after a bit of time, and this isn't just an instant thing, I worked out that my neurological system took 4 hours basically to just whoa. So I tried to implement a plan that said, right, I'm going to stop work at 7 o'clock, and that gives me a chance then of getting to sleep at 11. You can see what's going to happen in this household tonight. With this meeting. So I think you then have to go through this cycle of learning about yourself. But cognitive dissonance. So when I see a picture and it's not straight, you know, I notice it. So it's things that you notice. They may or may not be interesting to you, but you can't help noticing them. You know, what they're saying in this sermon, it just doesn't work. Sorry, yeah. And so I, in my book, talk about a road sign that says, you come up to roadworks, and it says use both lanes. Well, you can't use both lanes. You know, what it should say is use either lane. Now, did my wife notice this sign? Yes. Did it bother her? No. It just, woof, it obviously means use either lane. Me, I'm still talking about it 15 years later. So I think it's, you know, what is it that mentally obsesses you, that you kind of notice and you can't put it down, and that sort of stuff.
Just one more question, and the question goes, does responding to differences mean that we have to know the difficulties of each member of our congregation?
I think we need to know each member of our congregation. We need to know them.
Somebody needs to know them.
We need to, and we need to listen, and we need to know strengths and as well as difficulties, and we need to know what they love as well as what they hate. You know, we're the body of Christ.
So I have a personal trainer that I have to work with for various reasons, which I won't go into, but he's a very avid Manchester United fan. I couldn't care 2 hoots about football, and certainly not Manchester United, even though I live in Manchester. But I have learned that if I watch Match of the Day occasionally, I pick up enough information to have a conversation with him, which is usually aimed at extending the gaps between the exercises, but don't tell him that. So no, you can't know all of these things. We don't expect people to be experts, but to be aware that you're not an expert. And when I say to you, this is a problem, that's a problem, to pile in immediately and say, oh yes, I have all the same problems. Don't just assume that you understand what the person is telling you. I think that's part of it. So, on the sensory thing, we're all humans. If you take a hot casserole out of the oven and you put it down and then you forget your oven gloves and pick it up, you're going to get burned and you're going to get a response, and you're going to get out of there. Well, a friend of mine, autistic guy, was talking about that sort of reaction from the dentist light in his eyes. And we all kind of go, oh, yeah, it's a bit bright, isn't it? A bit bright. No, he was talking about the oven casserole thing that basically says, I want to jump out the chair, I've got to get out of there. So no, we don't. But at the same time, don't assume that we do, because that's what often happens.
Time for one more question, or do you want to move on, Stuart?
Yeah, no, I'll give you 2 minutes.
Okay. How do we balance the generalisations of a disability group versus the needs of an individual?
This is where I think Chris is right. There isn't a checklist that sort of says, well, you do this, then you do that. So you go through a process of saying, well, that's complicated, isn't it? Let's talk to people about how do we do that? Well, and let's have a conversation. Because you don't need a conversation with what Liam said, the group that's in the middle, they've got it all kind of worked out, okay, because they tick all the boxes already. So have the conversation. Accept that this is complicated. We need to accept that the church can't. I think in my last webinar, a guy called Ian Lash runs a church in Georgia, so that you can't, and he's autistic and he's a minister, you can't run a church that's going to satisfy everybody about everything. So if you've got a very loud organ, make it clear to people, we've got a very loud organ. And so talk to people and include that and say that's a problem. And I think we in the pews need to understand that leadership is complicated as well. It's very easy to say, oh, they should do this. Well, okay, but there are 13 other dimensions that you don't see that make it more complicated.
I think relationships are, going back to what I said, are just so key, and being curious about how other people experience the world, and if there is something, wanting to know more rather than just assuming you know it all, because there's lots of things I don't know about how other people experience the world, even though I know quite well about how I experience the world. So it's kind of that consistent curiosity, I think, is almost key in relationships.
Yes. Well, and sometimes a bit of humour helps. You want to do this, but if we do that, well, this is ridiculous. Let's all have a laugh about it. But it's a serious thing. We need to sort it out. We've got a guy that I know. He has a real problem with the volume of music. He's been campaigning forever trying to get his church to tone it down a bit. They keep on saying, no, if you can't cope with it, go in this room and sit quietly and so on. And he says, I live in a house on my own. I don't want to go to church and sit in a room on my own. But on the other hand, he can't expect 200 people to say, oh, well, he wants that, so that's what we've all got to do. So there's got to be some sort of process, I think, and so some introduce a bit of humour and so on.
Thank you so much for such wonderful questions, and we've saved the unanswered ones.
Okay, well, let's draw this thing to a close then. And first of all, I just want to say an enormous thanks to the speakers who stepped up to help on the webinar. So to Penny, thank you, and Leon, and to Krisha. So that was wonderful. One of the things that I hope has been helpful in this webinar is that you've heard 4 different speakers with 4 different, very different approaches and different angles that they're coming from. And I hope there has been something there for everybody. What we have been wrestling with today is this whole notion that culture is hugely powerful. Somebody talked about it being the glue that holds us all together. But rather elusive in the sense that we swim about in the water, but we don't notice the water. unless we're one of the outsiders, where we're very, very clear that there's no water where we are. And that has a very real effect. So culture, then, we've said, is about hidden assumptions, hidden beliefs and values that are often only revealed in situations. I think this point about not being able to satisfy everybody all of the time is quite worth a comment as we go our separate ways. I mean, in our church, we have been on a journey of inclusion, but in a sense, we used to believe this on this topic, now we believe that. So, okay, so what if you're one of these guys? Does that mean you've got to leave? Have we just rearranged the categories of people that we include and exclude? So we have to be aware that there will always be those barriers, and all we can do is reach out in a spirit of love, have the discussion, and make what changes we can. And so, no, we can't be an expert on every. I don't expect people to be an expert on autism, but we've got to go somewhere between the trite statement that says nothing. All autistic people are different. Once you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Well, that tells you sort of nothing really, apart from the fact that we're all different. Well, we knew that. On the other hand, you say, autistic people do this. Like loud music, like quiet music. You can bet your bottom dollar that the first autistic person you meet says the complete opposite. So we're all human beings. We all share the human condition. Let's learn together. And so one of the things that we didn't talk about today, for example, from an autistic point of view, is the sense in the church that feelings are more important than the truth. So if I say something and it's true, but the way I say it is a bit clumsy and people feel a bit kind of upset, then all that you hear about is, I feel upset, I don't, yeah, but what about what I've said? Is that true? Well, yes, but you shouldn't upset people. So from an autistic people, that's a difficult issue. So there are many of these things that are quite sharp. So thank you for exploring those with us, and we will close there.